Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about, getting off subject for a little bit, talk about the battles of Napoleon Bonaparte and in the early 1800s in Europe. Now, we're dealing with somebody, Napoleon, who's possibly the greatest military genius of all time, certainly on a battlefield level. I mean, you could possibly put others in there like a Julius Caesar, but really the stature of Napoleon is such that he'll stand out no matter which way you look at. Now, you can criticize Napoleon for things like grand sort of big picture strategy, things like that, but at a battlefield level, I think he'd be tough to beat in terms of the level of genius and capability he brought to the battlefield. Now, he was a bit of a natural, I think, on this, because if you look at the experience he had when he started winning decisive battles, he was competing against the generals on the other side. Typically had more experience and more training in battlefield tactics, things like that. So, nonetheless, what intrigues anybody, any onlooker to the battles, and certainly me. And I noticed this some years ago, but I was reading. I was on a I did a train journey, and I grabbed a book, and it just reintroduced this subject to me. Was how Napoleon would often arrive in a battlefield, and the enemy had set up because you got Napoleon seeking battle. He's seeking decisive battle. Now, whether it's the Russians or the Austrians or whoever the fuck it is. On the other side, they don't necessarily need a battle. Time is more on their side than it is on Napoleon's. Napoleon's, because say the Austrians, for example, the Austrians would declare war, and they do it in concert with the Russians. So they declare war on France. Now they do it, say, fairly late in the season, so winter's approaching. It's not really ideal battle conditions. And typically military campaigning is done starting in the sort of mid-spring through into, say, mid-autumn, early autumn. That's the campaigning season, because you get the longer days and that sort of stuff. So in Northern Europe like that, it gets light early in the morning, and it's still relatively light at 9:30, 10 at night. So you've got a long day to get a battlefield decision. But so when the Austrians or the Russians would declare war late in the season, they would assume, well, there's no way Napoleon can get his troops into the field or get his army into the field this amount of time. But Napoleon broke those rules. He would do forced marches, and he had the corps system that he developed. Again, organizationally very important. So the corps system would be independent sort of mini armies that would march along separate trajectories and then would join together, but quite disciplined. They're self-contained. They've got all their engineering and their artillery and their wagons with all the food and resources on it and so on. So Napoleon could move quite a large army around much more quickly than was hitherto the case. So he would So when war was declared and winter was sort of approaching, Napoleon could still put an army in the field and get over there. So he was seeking, typically the scenario is this, it's Napoleon that's seeking decisive battle. Now it could be decisive battle because, again, the season, time's running out. It's going to be the thick end of winter in a few weeks, that sort of stuff. But also the enemy would be marching at a much slower rate. So Napoleon would arrive much earlier than the other guys had anticipated, and before they had maybe, their armies had merged to create a full size. So they were still on the march. Parts of their army were on the march. Excuse me. So anyway, I want to look at, in particular, say, Austerlitz in 1805. Now, Austerlitz is touted as one of Napoleon's great victories because on paper he should have lost. But let's just have a look at this and understand, because there's a key factor in most, if not all, of Napoleon's wins, is that the the other guys thought they were smarter than him. They thought all Napoleon's victories must have been just flukes or just good luck, or because Napoleon is lower nobility. He's like a very minor nobility and regional nobility. He's not even French, really. So like he's Corsican. So they're looking at him saying, well, he's not an aristocrat. He's not a serious person. This military stuff, this leading armies, it's a job for aristocrats, people with breeding and people with long traditions of aristocratic sort of prestige and status. Napoleon's like a two-bit fucking bum. Like, what's this guy? So it must have all been good luck, or maybe the guys that were fighting previously aren't as good as me, because I'm going to kick his ass. And so there's a lot of stuff in there that a lot of attitude where they just couldn't extend the credit to Napoleon that he deserved. Clearly, he was a battlefield genius. Even if he didn't want to credit that, you'd say, well, he's a very competent general. He's unlikely to make mistakes, and certainly not the glaring errors that many of the aristocratic amateurs would make. So it's surprising that at Austerlitz, the Russians and the Austrians, they've got quite a commanding position. They've chosen a good position for the battle, and they outnumber Napoleon by, depending on whose numbers, say Napoleon's got sort of, say, 65,000, they've got 75,000. These are approximately the numbers. Now, they've got reinforcements on the march, but they won't get there for some days. Napoleon's got a few reinforcements on the march, Marshal Davout's column, so they are going to get there. But when the battle starts, Napoleon's maybe more than 20,000 soldiers short. So the Austrian and the Russian armies, by this stage, they're the various kings. The Russian Tsar's decided to deal himself into the game, which is complicated things, and everybody's looking for glory. And I'm the guy who beat Napoleon, and so all they've got to do is hold their commanding position. And it's a good position. The Russian artillery is there. Some of the Russian artillery officers are quite well trained, so experienced. So they got good artillery in place there. They've got a decent cavalry contingent. So a lot of the troops are battle seasoned. So all they've got to do is hold their position, and they're probably going to win. It's Napoleon who has to force battle. He's the guy who's running on the clock, not them. And if he can't force a decisive battle, then he's got to go. If he tries to retreat, he'll be harassed and defeated there. So Napoleon has to force a decisive battle. This seems to have escaped them. So anyway, they look at Napoleon's dispositions. This is the Austrians and the Russians, and they think, well, his right flank or his right side is pretty weak. So why don't we attack that, and then we can just roll him up and we can kick his ass all the way back to Paris. Now, this is 1805. Napoleon's already won many battles, and impressively so. So this idea that, look at the mistake Napoleon's made there. What an amateur. It's a sort of rookie amateur mistake. Now, sure, there are reinforcements en route, on march, which Napoleon is hoping will get there as the battle begins, which in fact they did. And they will reinforce that Napoleon's right wing. But nonetheless, that's not a mistake that someone like Napoleon would make. But it's assumed in discussions, well, look at this mistake Napoleon's made. What a fucking amateur. The guy's a beginner. He doesn't know shit about battle. Now, why you would even think that or think it was possible is this the only time he's made a mistake? But all of these people are carried away on the Austrian-Russian side. Here's our big chance for glory and military glory, and to kick that punk's ass, and so on. So they got it was a clouded judgment for sure. So they redevised their own battlefield tactics at Austerlitz on the assumption that they could attack the weakened or the weak right wing, Napoleon's right wing, and then could roll up the whole French army, and that's it. What a great victory. So they left their secure, winnable position to play a high-risk game. And this is the bit that you see this time and again in the battles with Napoleon, whether it's the Prussians later on or there's that they engage in an unusual amount of risk on the assumption Napoleon has made a mistake, or that Napoleon won't be able to react quickly enough, or that they've discovered some weakness that only they can see and Napoleon hasn't noticed. And I'm astonished at how often this happens, and how generals of much lesser caliber than Napoleon figure that they can outguess him and outwit him and so on. Now, if you look at the French command structure, one of the things again that was decisive in French victories was Napoleon's ability. I mean, he could read the battle, and bear in mind there's fog and cannon dust and cannonballs going off and gunpowder in the air, and so seeing everything clearly is no easy feat. But Napoleon's up there on a hill watching, and he's got his his telescope or his eyeglass there, and he can spot things, and he could read a battle like very few could. So he could spot, now that there's a problem developing over there, let's get another detachment of troops there. So if you can get, if your battle line's about to crack, but you can get several thousand guys, fresh troops out there in time to fortify that battle line, that can be the difference between defeat and victory, because the enemy's now exhausted themselves. They didn't get the break in the line they wanted. Now you can counterattack them and rout them. So this timing can be, I mean, if these reinforcements of that part of the line that's cracking arrive 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later, that's too late. The rout's already begun. To repair a rout of that size can itself take all your resources. So Napoleon could read the battle and move troops and units around in a way that others couldn't. Similarly, the command structure that Napoleon had put in place was such that they had that flexibility to do that, whereas it's far more cumbersome for the Russians, the Austrians, or even the Prussians for that matter, to move troops around. By the time that a problem was realised and the order would go out, then they were much slower to respond, move around, and repair damage in the lines than Napoleon was. And that was also a big factor. But the biggest factor of all in these battles was these low-quality generals on the other side believing that they'd spotted a fatal flaw in Napoleon's strategy. And most of the time, often Napoleon had set this up. He'd leave what was an obvious weakness, hoping that it was a baited trap, hoping that the other side would go for it, so then he could spring his trap on them. And this gave him many victories, Austerlitz among them, where the Austrians and the Russians went to make the attack on this weakened right wing, and again, but found themselves down outflanked with French troops coming in from behind them, and it was them who were routed. Just to give you an idea, again, the Russians and the Austrians had a commanding defensive position from which it would have been very difficult for Napoleon to win, and to would have been heavy casualties to assault, something like that. So they could have held that. Further reinforcements would have arrived in a few days. And so they could have either defeated Napoleon or made his victory so costly that he was exhausted and couldn't continue that particular aspect of the conflict, at least. But instead they gave up their commanding position, went for a high risk strategy, and got defeated. Now the French losses in Austerlitz were if you include the wounded, somewhere around the 7,000 mark. But the losses of in terms of wounded, prisoners and so on to the other side were pushing 30,000. It gives you an idea. Close on half their army, or certainly 40% of the Russian-Austrian army was obliterated, and yet 5% less than 5% casualties really overall for Napoleon's army. So it gives you an idea of the difference. So they threw away all their advantages on a high risk thing, believing they'd outwitted Napoleon. But as he goes through each of his victories, Austerlitz again touted as one of the greatest. He's constantly constantly being underestimated by low caliber generals who should know better. And again, I think some of this was a class thing. Napoleon was lower nobility; they were upper echelon aristocrats. But also this pursuit. I won't be the guy who beat Napoleon. All his victories have just been flukes. I'm the serious opposition that's going to beat him this time. And so there was a degree of hubris that also overcame these people. But they fell into the same trap again and again. And even when you look at Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington, who fancied himself as a top drawer general, and the numbers were about the same. Even he, and it was a hard fought contest, a bit like Borodino. It was a hard fought contest. But even there, if the Prussians had even arrived a few hours later than they did, the Duke of Wellington, would have been defeated at Waterloo. And so I'm not sure what condition Napoleon's troops would have been in then to handle the Prussians when they arrived. But nonetheless, even if Napoleon, who won the day from both, the casualties would have been enormous and the expenditure of resources. So it's unlikely he'd have been in position to have a battle for several weeks afterwards. But even so, this idea that high risk strategy could be taken, or battlefield tactics could be taken against Napoleon, was time and time again the cause of Napoleon's victories. His great generalship notwithstanding. You've been a Tacitus State, you're a Pushback Channel, and thank you for listening.